Yeah, I'm recording it.
That
now.
works.
Cool.
Okay.
Let me know when you're ready.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Sophia. Go for it.
So basically, I'm doing this symposium on the 28th of May, and it's about how we can learn about the epidemics of the past. And I have chosen to speak about Naples. The challenge is that I have to do it in 8 minutes, and they've been pretty prescriptive with the way that we can present our case studies. So this is the format that I have to follow. And for this reason, it's pretty basic. It's meant to be for a generalist audience, so it's a good way to practice that. And I haven't managed to get it to 8 minutes yet. So if there's any bits that you think I can cut, then that would be very useful. And yeah, okay. So I'm going to start. Hopefully. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about how the Neapolitan government responded to the cholera epidemics in the 19th century by highlighting the story which the government constructed to frame change. One of the major threads of my research is how change was leveraged in Italian cities through the claim that they were returning to the Roman past. Governments used the Roman past to create the impression of continuity and to gain trust that they would provide a better future. And the main point that I want to make today is that in Naples, the city's Roman past was used to hinder reform, creating a divide between the elite and the poor, which left major issues unresolved. What you're looking at is a map of Italy, which overlays a study of major cholera epidemics upon a study of the terrain. This is because cholera was still understood to be a product of the local climate rather than water specifically. And Naples was one of the largest cities in Europe and suffered particularly badly from cholera because it lacked the clean water systems, which were now being introduced across Europe to safeguard against disease. Governments providing such infrastructure found legitimacy in their devotion to the public good. Naples did not have clean water systems and saw cholera as symptomatic of state neglect. You can see that imagining Italy this way would stigmatize Naples, which looks like a blemish. Such maps played into existing prejudices, which had long located Naples within an imaginary geography of the South. Continuing disease and poverty was used to indicate that the climate had made them barbarian, lazy, and backwards. It's important to note that the way the Neapolitan government handled the cholera epidemic was shaped by the desire to refute a stereotype and so prove that Naples was a civilized city. It was really the lack of investment, housing model, and water systems which contributed most to continual disease. The poor lived in fondechi, high-density houses of many stories with little ventilation and light. There was also an active culture of water selling. Water was brought from wells and sold across the city by thousands of acquaioli. These factors in combination made the city vulnerable to outbreaks of epidemics. It's clear that the poor would be worst affected by these changes. It was believed that eliminating the contexts in which they lived would eliminate disease. But the underlying factors were the failures of liberal government to provide any kind of health welfare. This in turn promoted organized crime. Meanwhile, political factions in the right and left used urban renewal as a way to compete for popularity without delivering on their promises. As has been studied by Frank Snowden, there were two major cholera epidemics in Naples in 1884 and in 1910. The epidemic in 1884 devastated the poor of Naples to such an extent that the state declared its first ever sanitation campaign, the Risanamento di Napoli, the hygienic redemption of the city. It had three main objectives: clean drinking water, plumbing, and new housing. The government asked for patience. Even if this process would take 10 years, it would provide the city with a defense system against disease in future. What you see here on the left is the plan for the demolitions and the paving for the major road, the Retifilo, which cut through the three poorest quarters in Naples, where disease was understood to be the worst. Of 271 roads, 141 were demolished, more than halving the population density. Further to this, a high percentage of the fountains were removed and inhabitants were obligated by law to use the new Serena water. These changes, though rational to reformers, were major for Neapolitan society, given the culture and the character of the city had long been shaped by its layout and water practices. Moreover, a knowledge of microbiology was only just forming, so the necessity and efficacy of such changes was difficult to communicate. The government adopted the narrative that Naples was being restored to the glories of the monumental and clean ancient Roman city. This was clearly informed by the attractiveness of emphasizing a Roman past in the new national context and the fact that Rome was associated with civility, cleanliness, and industry. The new aqueduct was supplied by the same water which supplied the ancient city, which reformers claimed must be pure and safe. It was chosen above others because descriptions in ancient sources recommended and guaranteed its purity. It was imbued with quasi-talismanic properties. I quote, "The redemption of Naples will be the pure and clear waters of Sereno. It will cook vegetables perfectly, prevent digestive problems, and best of all, produce good and healthy women." Songs celebrated that with this truly Roman work, cholera had been conquered in Naples. The Neapolitans were told that they would now be safe because good government had returned the city to the health it last enjoyed in the Roman period. But this was untrue. The demolitions had replaced the poor housing with these boulevards for the emergent middle class. The poor, as critics wrote, had been squashed behind facades to make way for elite promenades by the sea. Worst of all, the aqueduct was particularly disastrous because it was built badly by a foreign company, and the leaky pipes caused houses to collapse and sink, putting people's lives at risk. Because of this, seeing their liberties infringed, the population distrusted the safety of the Sereno water, claiming it was poisoned, and began to break into the old fountains, thereby increasing the risk of infection. Even if the government claimed to have acted in the interests of the public good, it had put commercial and aesthetic objectives above those of its citizens. The inquest held after the risanamento found that neither the demolitions nor the clean water had done anything to improve things for those who were most needy. In the same year that Naples was ruled the city with the most urgent health needs in the kingdom, the town hall had spent 1% of its budget on sanitation. And there was no greater indication of this negligence than in 1910, when another epidemic occurred, described by Frank Snowden as the epidemic that disappeared. In the knowledge that it had done nothing, the government denied that cholera had actually occurred in order to protect civic pride, foreign trade interests, and guarantee its own stability. In the official history written of the episode, the hygiene minister compared the infrastructure in ancient and modern Naples as irrefutable proof that the government had been prepared and the aqueduct had saved the city. He claimed that Naples had achieved a great sanitary victory against cholera. I quote, "The structure completed by the Romans with a powerful and magnificent mindset, with marvelous wisdom and technique, with a truly Latin firmness, has been built today in a manner worthy of ancient men. We can guarantee that the Sereno, which saved the ancient city of the Siren from so many epidemics, has done so again." If the relevance which this episode has for the COVID era has not already come through, I think the major points to make are that disease affects vulnerable populations who are stigmatized and neglected. The response to disease needs to actually address and not displace such communities. Whilst in this crisis, we may emphasize the cult of the medic, this is just one of the many narratives which will not bring about real change. The fundamental reasons why this pandemic has happened are lack of preparation and infrastructural investment. These should not be politicized in the coming years, but actually addressed if we do not want the same situation to recur and undermine the trust held between citizens and the government as it did in Naples. Thank you. I don't know how long that was. Do you know how long that was? No, it was about 8.
We could have timed it if you'd given a warning.
It's definitely longer than 8 minutes. It's really difficult to do. Yeah, I hope did it make sense? Does anyone have any questions?
What would be most useful for you to do with the time, Sophia?
I don't really know. I just is it illustrated properly? Do the illustrations make sense with what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay.
I thought it was a really good paper. I mean, I know almost nothing about the period, but you took me through it really patiently, thoroughly. I really enjoyed it. I
Thank
can
you.
see how it would be difficult to cut any of it though. And I guess if I had a question, it would be what happened after, because I assume this isn't still the case in Naples. And in
No.
terms of, okay, we've got to have inquiries and we've got to figure out how we do prepare for such events in future. I guess there's an interesting kind of gap between the epidemic that didn't happen and then where we are now, in terms of like governments never seem to listen to inquiries. So what actually changed from 1911 until now, where I assume they don't have this terrible aqueduct that people think is poisoned?
Fascism happened. That's the problem.
Okay.
So they invested a lot in the infrastructure and actually got more better water under Mussolini. So that's one of the problems.
I can see how you don't want that to be the takeaway point, to be like, well, guys, here we go.
Given some of the government responses, yeah. But I could say that. I'm sure that question would be asked. Yeah, they didn't. One of the things about this is like obviously we're going to have an inquest, but it's like with Grenfell, the inquest is like done because of the sake of it, for the sake of it, and then you don't really hear that there's any response.
Yeah, I mean, my mum submitted evidence for the select committee on COVID, and her exact evidence was like, they don't listen to inquiries. Like, inquiries have findings, and those findings are never carried through because that's not the point of the inquiry to the people who call it.
Yeah,
But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think if you can trim it down to size, it would be perfect. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Do I speak too quickly? No. Okay.
You could speak quicker and then you'd get more in.
I don't know. I have quite a monotone, so I'm just brilliant. Okay, that's really useful. Yeah, so on the 28th, if anyone wants to listen to it, you can just go online. I think it's on YouTube.
So what's the conference?
It's run by Columbia and it might be Michigan. I don't know. Someone sent it to me online, and apparently like 300 people are coming online. Oh, thanks, Ethan. So we'll see. The people that are speaking, there's no one else really doing 19th century stuff. Most of them are from 15th century, or actually no, yeah, it's a real mix of people and a lot of independent scholars, which is quite interesting. I wonder.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Thanks, Phil. I thought that was wicked. And I think perfect pace and everything. And yeah, crammed a lot in 8 minutes or however long it was. I was really interested in what you were saying about the use and abuse of the classics and how the Roman model was dangerous. And I was thinking that similar cases have been made for classical rhetoric used for COVID. So there's been stuff written on Eidolon about how Thucydides' narrative is actually really unhelpful and dangerous to apply to now for all these various reasons. There are scholars out there kind of thinking through why actually these classical narratives of plagues aren't actually useful models for now. And I thought you could fit that in as well, if of interest.
Definitely, thank you. This is like one of the main things that I'm saying in my thesis also, is that you can't model our response on ancient responses anyway, because they have a completely different understanding of causality. And yeah, so I will definitely say that at the beginning.
Can I build on to what Albert said?
Yeah.
I thought that was also drawn out really well when you talk about the aqueduct. and like how that in particular I feel like is a very Roman solution to like whatever the late 19th century problem. And so the fact that it was built by a foreign company and it ended up actually, you know, contributing to more, or like it didn't actually solve it at all, I think could kind of go along with what Albert was saying.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a British company.
It was a really well delivered paper though. I think the pace was really good. I don't know what you could take out.
Thank you. That's okay. Well, it's really encouraging. I've got until the 28th, so I'm sure I can cut adjectives. Yeah. Joe?
Yeah, this wouldn't be something you put in the paper, but I was just wondering in general, like in Roman times, well, yeah, like first century AD on, really. Naples and that whole area gets this kind of insalubrious, you know, reputation for wantonness, and it's where you, well, actually, yeah, first century BC and everything, yeah, is it there in Cicero and everything? Does that carry on? So I'm not talking about physically lack of cleanliness, a moral lack of cleanliness.
So they stress that, you know, Naples was a site for elite otium and complementary to Rome because the Romans would go there, and they really try and push that as we're going to be in partnership with Rome now after unification. That's going to be our role, you know. The criticisms of Naples are that it's got the highest number of churches in the whole nation, but it's like the least religious city in the whole nation. Yeah, other things they stress are the fact that Virgil was there. They love Nero. So the way that they get the aqueduct in the first place is by saying that Nero came to Naples and he didn't burn it down, but he did burn Rome down because Rome was less healthy than Naples. And so we must make our city like it was an antiquity because Nero loved Naples.
He loved it enough not to destroy it.
Yeah, exactly. And they say we exist in a greater state of barbarity now than we did than Nero. We are more barbarous than Nero, basically.
Wow.
But these are genuine arguments that they're making in order to get to like petition for change.
Thank you.
Is that all the questions?
Melissa has a question.
Oh, Melissa, yeah, sorry.
Yes. Sorry, I had an interesting question about the sort of rhetoric surrounding pandemics. And one thing that kind of popped up a lot at the very beginning of COVID, and it's kind of probably for a good reason kind of slipped down what people are saying at the moment, was the idea that this is what was a great leveler, as if pandemics, because it's a disease, it means that it affects everyone equally, and sort of, oh, this is the great leveler, it affects every corner of society and every nation, and we all need to pull together and all of that. And it was very, very stressed. And I was wondering whether there is any evidence for that kind of attitude also being taken in the case study of Naples, or whether it's a very recent, a more recent thing.
I think that it was much more associated with the poor. Cholera was still seen as a filth disease, so a lot of it was that only dirty people could suffer from cholera anyway.
Yeah.
I don't think it was certainly not, I mean, it affected the whole city, but that's a really, really good point. COVID isn't a leveler, and I can contrast that.
Yeah. Because it's a really nice, I think, yeah, I thought it would be a good contrast. And I think particularly with sort of the way kind of the current pandemic is spreading, it's kind of hit nations where there was a lot of international travel first. And then certain countries are getting over it and be like, oh, we're fine now, and then kind of forgetting that places like, I don't know, Pakistan, India, certain African countries as well, where there is a lot more crowding, like forgetting that is going to be catastrophic. So
yeah, the time lag is really funny, isn't
Yeah.
it? Like a different emotional state across. Yeah. The Naples was also always like one of the worst places because it had a port and people were passing through the port the whole time. Yeah, no, that is useful. Thank you.
It also hit wealthier areas in the UK. So like the area in London that it hit first was the place where most people had been literally on skiing holidays. So you have that the same.
Because
Sorry.
the poor in Naples were hit because they all lived around the port, and the rich lived up on the high bits, so further away from the boggy ground, and they didn't suffer so badly because of where they lived. Whereas now,
but the only reason that we call it the Great Leveller is because of the NHS and the way that the NHS is designed to work, which is in times of emergency, everything is requisitioned. And in times of, or I suppose with all national health services, that everyone is seen as as equal, and then the triage is based on age, health, social responsibilities and stuff, rather than wealth, because it's now a public service in the sense of a shortage. So there is kind of that, like, that's probably why you can, it would be if you had universal, or if you had national healthcare in Naples, then if you'd had it in Naples, then you would have had a kind of equality in terms of who was treated. But here, but
also
that's why it's
and possibly something on separation of what you're saying about separation of people. So the poor down by the port, and then the rich living up somewhere separate. The way COVID has affected South Africa in particular is interesting in that, and kind of horrifying in that basically there isn't really, and it's one of the few countries where there isn't really any crossover between the kind of the kind of township slum areas of cities, and then the kind of very rich white gated communities. So apparently there has actually been very little cross infection, where that's different from a lot of other countries.
Where's that, sorry?
South Africa. Like the wealth inequality is like I can't remember the statistics, but it's still genuinely horrifying. It's like the worst in the world.
I think if I could add to that, I think it's being called the leveler in other places, not just the UK. Like the United States also has this like erroneous concept of it being a disease that affects everyone equally, when of course all of those factors, like, I mean, if you're doing triage and you're trying to figure out who's most likely to live, it's still the people who've had better healthcare their entire lives. So I think the leveler point isn't I think it isn't restricted to the UK right now in terms of the rhetoric, and I also think that it is wrong for more reasons than just, it's only because of for generalized healthcare. Like there's more, I think.
Thank you.
Well, there's also the what's it called? The disability model of, no, it's the accessibility model of disability.
What does that mean?
No, it's, sorry, I was reading Albert's comment. I'm trying to remember what it's called. The model of the disability is to do with wealth and access, and if you construct a city that has limited access, then you create disabilities within. But I've totally forgotten what it's called. The mobility? No. There's an expression that a lot of disability activists use, and it's this idea that health health is called, and that's where intersectionality in terms of class and wealth divide. If you have money, your disability is lessened, and if you have a completely accessible city, then you don't have a disability.
Okay. So sorry, disability, wealth, and access.
It's an intersectional view of disability, but I can't remember the name of it off the top at the moment. But it means that if you have less money, you end up with health condition. You also end up with health issues, and you also have, yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask, the kind of middle, I guess upper middle class and wealthy Neapolitans, did they have servants that lived in, or just because I read somewhere recently that actually in some epidemic, the worst hit streets were actually in the wealthiest districts because it was servants who were primarily getting the illness and then dying?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I think that they would have had servants, but they probably wouldn't have had servants from down near the. I don't know the answer to that. They did impose quarantines, like actual people couldn't move around. At least in theory. Yeah, I could look at that. But definitely the outcome was not that the richest streets were worst hit, which might suggest that that's not. Oh, they weren't moving. Oh.
Did you happen to read? Well, I got tired of the chance. Sorry.
I like your background.
Yeah. So you need to have a Naples background or something, don't you, for the presentation? Did you happen to read? And this was before. I don't know. Maybe he was feeling lonely when the Vice Chancellor was sending all those emails on and on every day. I gave up reading them quite early, but one of them was actually interesting. He sent a link to a series of plague entries from Cambridge when Cambridge was hit by the plague.
No, I didn't see that. What did they say?
I'll email it to you. But there was some stuff from the Gesta of Gonville and Keys.
When was Cambridge hit by the plague?
1593 was one of them.
1593.
The plague raging in the town, it was ordered that the scholars and pensioners should be sent by their tutors into the country till January. December, the plague still raging. The above order was extended to February.
Oh my God.
1603, the plague raging. Leave of absence was granted to all on the foundation till January. Plague again, leave of absence till January, just on and on and on and on. And they even did this.
Is ridiculous. Go on.
They even did something of a furlough system. Everyone should leave the colleges. That all the bed makers, this is a university ordinance, that all the bed makers except two be immediately turned out of the college and be allowed 2 shillings apiece every week.
Is that a lot?
I don't know how much it was, but clearly some kind of furlough scheme going on.
Yeah, it's the same stuff, isn't it?
2% of the standard wage, obviously.
Anyway, I'll email you the link.
Thank you.
Well, I've got a question for Sofia.
Hi, good.
George here. Well, I was wondering, what were the Christian responses
Yeah,
to the
terrible.
disease? I mean, if Naples was not a part of ancient Rome, then what was the input of Christian Rome to all that? I don't know if you know
What do
something
you think?
about it.
Sorry, Neapolitans' attitudes to their medieval.
Yeah.
So they,
Yeah.
at least the hygiene minister, the same guy who said that Naples had returned to its state of health, wrote a history of Naples throughout the centuries, which obviously argued that they had lost all healthiness after the crumbling ancient city, like decline and fall of Rome. and that since then nobody had built for the public good, and only the present administration was actually doing that. So they cast that period as sort of dirty and unhygienic. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. So, but because you presented us the classical perspective, and these people, after all, they were Catholics, okay, and they had been forever under the auspices of the Catholic Church, and I don't know if that could affect public discourse or even shape agendas, but yeah. It seems that
they loved churches. They were they spread disease by being in churches because of the holy water. So holy water practices were banned.
Wow.
Which was pretty big, but people went to churches anyway, and that was part of like closing the fountains was also closing the churches, and they demolished like 80 churches, which is a lot of churches. There are 400 churches in Naples, so anyway. Yeah, and then they said that San Gennaro, who's like the patron saint of Naples, was going to save them also. So I think it was a mix of who's going to save us. But then also, sorry, the narrative that they were returning to the ancient city is very much like an elite narrative. So probably the poor were more thinking about like religious.
About religion.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So you just touched on kind of elite narratives. Oh,
George, you need to mute your mic.
Sorry, my connection's really bad. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, elite narratives. Who is writing your texts? Are they all coming from the government? And is it the only narrative that's being sold? Because now we have kind of a lot of competing narratives about the coronavirus. And yeah, so who's writing the texts and who are they aimed at? Does it ever kind of filter down to the people who are actually using the fountains in the street? Do they ever see any of this kind of use of the past?
That's such a good question. So the texts are being written by the hygiene minister, and this is like a very new infrastructure that they've put in, and it coincides with very intense history writing in Naples in that period. The newspaper that I showed, that was left wing and covering all the failures of the government, so like pushing against the government narrative. But in the 1910 epidemic, the press was censored, so there was that one sort of official narrative only. I don't know about how to look at other responses to the epidemic from like lower classes, really. But what's being written down, or at least what I have found, has always been, we are saving Naples because we're great sanitary soldiers.
Are they discussing it in any of the newspapers that circulate more cheaply? I know this, I don't know if this applies in Italy, but there's a lot of newspapers in Britain that are kind of predominantly for advertisement. So they're quite often free. I don't know if there's any images or things like that in those that might potentially be useful.
I don't know. It's quite hard to get hold of Neapolitan newspapers. So the only ones that I've been able to get are like the major ones. But yeah, that's a good point. I don't know how much was going on in the press, how much was being published. But they must have like presents and stuff.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if they're not the target audience, then that might actually be quite interesting.
Yeah,
the absence might be interesting in itself.
In the newspaper, they have a column that's like hygiene for everyone, where they're trying to teach the poor good hygiene. So they go, you should wash your hands at least once a day. When it's like, you stop using your pasta water more than once because people are using it 10 times. and that's creating like yucky water for cholera. Yeah, different newspapers.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. Or did you go already? Yeah.
Shall we wrap up?
Oh yeah, sorry.
It's really interesting thinking about it. It's like the first conversation I've had about the pandemic without feeling like this